Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Great to see all of you here. Great to have a packed house here this evening. Thank you all for coming out. As many of you know who've been following, who are sort of groupies of our program, this is our third sold-out lecture of the season. We work really hard to bring in speakers who can address topics that are of broad interest to the community and also that are on subjects that are timely. If you enjoy, I want to ask you, if you haven't already, to please become a member of our program. Membership costs only $36, and it's a really important way for you to show support for everything that we do here. And for those of you who are here who are members, I know many of you are, I want to thank you for your continued interest and your loyalty. And along these lines, I also do want to make a special note to thank our donors, particularly those who choose to underwrite particular lectures that we have here. This evening's lecture is sponsored by our general fund, but as you look through our catalog and our materials, please keep in mind, we're always very appreciative when we receive sponsorship for particular events. As you know, we rely on philanthropic dollars and are very grateful for community involvement. With that, I want to tell you just about a couple of upcoming events. One is I want to draw your attention to our monthly program called Tribe Talk, New Jewish Conversations. This is an edgy, informative, and engaging monthly program about trending Jewish news that I run together with my colleague Brian Amkraut, which reminds me that I did not introduce myself. My name is Alana Cooper. I direct Jewish lifelong learning at Case Western Reserve University. And the Tribe Talk program I run with Brian Amkraut, who's the executive director of our program. And we do this talk show together with a featured guest each month. In November, on November 20th, we'll be having Dan Malthrop of the City Club, who will be our guest. And we'll be engaging him on the topic of free speech on our campuses. The event is free and refreshments will be served. Given the fact that it's Dan Malthrop and free and refreshments will be served, this is likely to translate into a large crowd. So registration, usually for Tribe Talk, we just have registration requested, but registration will be mandatory for this event. Cheryl's waving at me in the back. We have postcards with information about Tribe Talk in the back. If you're interested and you want to register before you leave, you're welcome to do so. And now I want to turn to our guest speaker for the evening, Dr. Jonathan Schneer, who's with us from Georgia Tech at the School of History, Technology, and Society. He came in this afternoon. He is a British historian there who received his BA from McGill University and his PhD from Columbia University. Dr. Schneer is the co-editor of 2 books and the author of 6, or now more than 6, 8. Okay, his bio's a little, he can't keep up with his bio, or his bio can't keep up with him. But the author of now 8 books, I'll tell you the titles of just a few of them. London, 1900, The Imperial Metropolis, The Thames, England's River, the Balfour Declaration, which he'll be speaking about this evening. And I should note that the copies of the book are on sale afterwards, and you can get an autographed copy. Dr. Schneer has told me that he's going to stick around and sign copies for us. And this book won in 2010 the National Jewish Book Award. He's also the author of Winston Churchill's War Cabinet, which was published in 2015, which he'll be speaking about tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. If you haven't registered but are interested to come, we do have space for that lecture. Please let us know on your way out. Dr. Schneer has also published articles in leading scholarly journals and collections of essays. He was a founding member of Radical History Review and served as its book review editor for 7 years. He also served for many years on the editorial board of 20th Century British History. He's a member of the advisory board of the London Journal and has received fellowships from the Whiting Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and from numerous Oxford and Cambridge colleges. At Georgia Tech, Professor Schneer teaches modern British and modern European history to undergraduate and graduate students. And we're so happy that you're here to present your work to our public. Thank you. Please give Dr. Schneer a warm welcome.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for that really unnecessarily detailed biography. And I want anyway to thank Alana Cooper and also Cheryl Hirsch for expediting this entire business on my behalf. They are exemplary expediters. Okay, so let me begin. And I bring you to 100 years ago, 1917, November, the middle still of World War I, and nobody knew who would win it. The Western Front had proven to be a charnel house. Nobody could advance more than several hundred yards in either direction. And whenever they did advance that far, it wasn't worth it. Thousands or tens of thousands would die. Nobody could say who was going to win the war at that point. Russia was just about out of the war. There had been a revolution in February, and the Bolsheviks would, in fact, overthrow the liberal regime that had just been established at the end of October, beginning of November. The Americans had joined the war, but American troops had not yet arrived in Europe in any number, certainly not in numbers sufficient to make a difference. It would have been a rash person who predicted that one side would win or the other. That is the background to the famous Balfour Declaration of November 2, 1917. Probably everybody in this room knows what the Balfour Declaration was, very, very briefly, and the essential paragraph, in fact, is only 67 words. By the Declaration, Great Britain promised to support the establishment of a home for the Jewish people in Palestine, so long as that did not prejudice the rights of non-Jewish communities in the territory. Today, well, everybody, I think, today sees the Balfour Declaration as a foundation stone of modern Israel, and many people see it, therefore, as something to be celebrated. On the other hand, of course, many Arabs view it as the first step towards their dispossession and misery, and therefore something to be deplored. Historians who have written about the Declaration view it almost unanimously as the inevitable byproduct of a growing Anglo-Zionist intimacy. And most books about the Declaration celebrate the remarkable campaign led by the Zionist leader in Britain, Chaim Weizmann, who taught the principles of his movement to the British governing elite. Now, Weizmann was, in fact, a nearly unique figure. He was 1 in a million or 1 in 10 million, I'm sure. And yet, without discounting his extraordinary qualities, which I would never do, I have learned through my research and while writing this book to emphasize not the inevitability of his triumph, but its contingency. The Balfour Declaration nearly didn't happen, and moreover, it was not written in stone. Even after its publication, the British Prime Minister, whose name was David Lloyd George, was prepared to ignore it, to finesse it, to put it onto the side track under certain circumstances, and I'll be explaining them tonight. So, 1914, the beginning, right before the war began. Palestine, now let's see if I can do this. I can. Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, of course, had its capital in Constantinople. The center of the Ottoman Empire was Turkey, but it included most of the Middle East, including Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq, and Syria, including in those days Lebanon and Palestine, and the Arabian Peninsula, also, by the way, Egypt, or that rather Egypt was ostensibly under Ottoman control. It was de jure under Egypt, but de facto it was controlled by Great Britain. The British had controlled Egypt since 1882 because, of course, they were interested in controlling the country in which was located the Suez Canal, which was their economic jugular vein. Now, the Ottoman Empire was ruled by a revolutionary political party called the CUP, Committee of Union and Progress, and a triumvirate of three men ruled the CUP, and they were called Enver, Talat, and Jamal, and you'll be hearing a little bit about them as I go on with the talk. The Ottoman Empire was ruled by a sultan who was also the Caliph of Islam. The Caliph of Islam you can think of as something similar to the Pope of Rome, except that the Caliph was also a sultan and so had temporal power as well as religious power. But really, the Sultan was a puppet of the Committee of Union and Progress. Now, the British had long-standing interests in the Middle East because of the Suez Canal. And actually, the French also had long-standing interests, economic interests, in Syria and in Lebanon. In 1914, the ruler of the Hejaz, which is modern-day Saudi Arabia by and large, was this man, the Grand Sharif Hussein. He is the Grand Sharif of the Hejaz, and the two cities in it, Mecca and Medina, were very important because they are holy cities in the Islamic religion. Moreover, the Grand Sharif was a direct descendant of Muhammad, the Prophet, and therefore he was considered to be second only to the Caliph as the most prestigious and holiest Muslim in the world. Now, the Grand Sharif Hussein in 1914 nurtured ambitions. He wanted at least autonomy, greater autonomy for the Hejaz within that great Ottoman Empire. He may even already have been dreaming taller dreams, dreams about independence from the Ottoman Empire. Now, he was not the only Arab nationalist in the years before World War I. Various groups had begun to emerge throughout the Ottoman Empire, demanding at least autonomy from the Turks. The first Arab Nationalist Congress met in Paris in 1913. And in that same year, the Grand Sharif Hussein sent his son, Abdullah, to meet with British officials in Egypt. And Abdullah asked them for support should his father rebel against the Ottoman Empire. He met first with this man, the British Consul General in Egypt, Horatio Kitchener, an extraordinary figure, and if you ask me questions later on, I can tell you amusing stories about him. Also, this man, Sir Ronald Storrs, who was Kitchener's Oriental secretary, his main assistant. And the burden of Abdullah's message to these men was, will you help us if we rebel against the Turks? We need machine guns and we need money. But they turned him down. They explained to him that Britain and the Ottoman Empire had friendly relations and that they would not support a rebellion against him. Then, however, came the outbreak of World War I. Well, that changed everything. The British feared, correctly, that the Ottomans would side with Germany, which they quickly did, and then a nightmare scenario presented itself to them. Britain ruled 100 million Muslim subjects in Egypt, in the Sudan, most of all, of course, in South Asia, India. Well, what if the Ottoman Sultan, who was also the Caliph of Islam, declared holy war? Then perhaps 100 million British subjects would rise up against them. Well, Kitchener was now in London. Storrs was still in Cairo, but of course they remembered the conversations the previous year with Abdullah. They thought, well, maybe we'd support a rebellion against the Ottomans after all, because then the Grand Sharif Hussein would be on our side fighting against our common enemy, and moreover, as the second holiest figure in Islam, he would weaken any call that the Caliph made for a jihad against Great Britain. And so Kitchener directed Storrs to get in touch with Abdullah and the Grand Sharif Hussein. Will you rebel? Because if you will, we'll support you after all. In fact, they even dangled the possibility of somehow supporting the Grand Sharif if he wanted to become Caliph and replace the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, which of course they had. That was not a gift in their power to bestow, and it is an index of how desperate they were to bring the Arabs onto their side in the war. And so began a fateful correspondence during 1915 and 1916. Now, Kitchener's temporary replacement in Egypt was this man, Sir Henry McMahon. Hang on while I just take a sip. I chose this particular depiction of McMahon with a reason. Does that face suggest to you a man of plain dealing and honesty? The McMahon-Hussein correspondence is one of the most infamous in history. And McMahon promised British support of an independent Arab kingdom of which Hussein would be the leader. He promised this in several letters to the Grand Sharif. What would be the boundaries of this independent Arab kingdom? Well, that's the sticking point, and much depends upon the translation of certain English words into Arabic and of how Hussein understood them. Historians have parsed those letters with a fine-tooth comb. They've come to no consensus. Zionists and supporters of McMahon conclude that Palestine was to be excluded from the envisioned Arab kingdom. But Arabs and critics of McMahon say that Palestine was always meant to be included. Now, I can't settle that argument, and I'm not going to try. But what is beyond dispute is that McMahon intentionally used vague words, vague language on this issue and on other issues. And he actually explained his strategy in a letter to the permanent secretary of the Foreign Office, whose name was Lord Harding. This is what he wrote, quote, "What we have to arrive at now is to tempt the Arab people into the right path, detach them from the enemy, and bring them onto our side. This, on our part, is at present largely a matter of words. And to succeed, we must use persuasive terms and abstain from academic haggling over conditions." Well, he was successful. With his encouragement, the Grand Sharif Hussein and his sons launched a rebellion against the Turks in June 1916. Meanwhile, back in London, the British government and Foreign Office realized that they'd better bring their French allies into the picture, tell them what they were doing in the Middle East. And so they chose this man, Sir Mark Sykes, who was an advisor to the government on Middle Eastern affairs, to speak for them. And the French chose an equally experienced diplomat. His name was François-Georges Picot, to speak for them. So these two men, Sykes and Picot, met in the Foreign Office at London, literally with maps and crayons, and I have seen the maps and the crayoned portions. They assumed the defeat of the Ottomans in the war, and they simply divvied up the Ottoman possessions. They redrew the map of the Middle East, and very broadly, they agreed that France would control Syria, which they colored blue on the map, and that Britain would control Mesopotamia, or Iraq as it is today, and they colored that red on the map. And they called these areas A and B. And since Palestine, with Jerusalem in it, which is holy to 3 different languages, is unique, they agreed that it should be either controlled by an international condominium of powers. Later on, they fudged that a bit, and the north was going to be controlled by France and the south by Great Britain. But anyway, they colored it brown. And here it is. This is not obviously what they did, but this shows you how they planned to redraw the map of the Middle East. Maybe it's not brown down there. By the way, with regard to the independent Arab kingdom promised to Hussein, Sykes and Picot decided that he would cede primacy to France in the northern part and to Britain in the southern part, and that they would offer him advice on how to rule those parts, advice, and I quote, that he must accept. But of course, they didn't tell him this, and the Sykes-Picot agreement is simply an example, bold and bald, of unmitigated European imperialism. So at British prompting and with British help, the Grand Sharif Hussein proceeded with his rebellion against Turkey. He may or may not have thought that Palestine would be a part of his new kingdom. He certainly did not know that in any event the European allies had the boundaries of his future kingdom planned for him and their own roles within it. I'm a British historian, and I can't speak in detail about the French, but I know from the archives that British deceit drove certain British figures who were involved with this and who were in the Middle East at the time. It drove them crazy, which I think is much to their credit. The most famous example is this man, Lawrence of Arabia. And I chose this depiction as well on purpose because I think he looks troubled in this depiction. And here is what he wrote to his superior. We are getting them, he's talking about the Arabs, we are getting them to fight for us on a lie, and I can't stand it. But he was not the only British figure on the ground to be troubled in this way. Another sip. Now, back in London, another group took profound interest in Palestine. The Zionists, of course, said that Palestine, which had been the homeland of the ancient Jewish people, should be its homeland again. It was part of the Ottoman Empire in 1914, 15, 16, and that was a problem because the Ottomans wouldn't give it back. In 1897, an Austrian journalist, Theodor Herzl, had founded the World Zionist Federation. And the first goal of the Federation was to persuade the Ottomans to allow massive Jewish immigration into Palestine. But the Ottomans wouldn't allow it. The next goal was to persuade one of the great powers to press the Turks to allow massive Jewish immigration into Palestine, and that didn't work either. In 1914, on the eve of World War I, Zionism was a world presence, a world organization. It had headquarters in Berlin. Zionism was relatively weak in Great Britain. In Britain in 1914, there were roughly 40 million inhabitants. The Jewish population was about 300,000. Of the 300,000 Jews in Great Britain in 1914, only 8,000 were Zionists, belonged to a Zionist organization, and there were several Zionist organizations. And most of them lived in London, 4,000 Zionists in London. But London is a city of 6 million, so that will show you how small the presence was. Most British Jews in 1914 thought of Zionism as a beautiful but impractical dream. They were much too busy trying to earn a living to have airy-fairy notions of moving somewhere several thousand miles away. It's not that they were overtly unfriendly to Zionism. They just couldn't take it seriously as practical politics at the moment. That there was, in fact, much latent support for Zionism would become apparent soon, but not yet. Moreover, some Jews objected strongly to Zionism, and they were the traditional spokesmen, really, of British Jewry. These people argued that Jews share a culture. They share a belief system, but not a nationality. Not a nationality. They can practice their beliefs anywhere, and they should therefore assimilate in their countries of residence. The Jews who had come to New York should become American Jews, not Jewish Americans, right? The Jews who'd moved to London should be British citizens first and Jews second. These people were called assimilationists because they argued for assimilation. And they said that the people who claimed that the Jews' true homeland was Palestine were only opening up the Jews of Britain and America and France and Canada to charges of dual allegiance. And that would only encourage anti-Semites who wanted them gone. And one of them said, Palestine will become the world's ghetto if the Zionists succeed. The leader of the anti-Zionist Jews in England was this man, a journalist called Lucien Wolfe. So now we come to the outbreak of World War I. And British Zionists, like people everywhere in the world, were appalled by this catastrophe. However, some realized it's also a great opportunity. Britain is at war with the Ottoman Empire. A British victory means an Ottoman defeat. If they then throw the Turks out of Palestine and establish their own protectorate, then the British could do what the Ottomans have never done. They could open up the country to massive Jewish immigration. Now, the British Zionist who understood this best, who seized the opportunity provided by it, was, of course, Chaim Weizmann. Weizmann was fairly well known in the World Zionist Federation, but he was actually a relatively obscure Zionist, maybe second-tier Zionist in the British Zionist world in 1914. He is going to vault now immediately into the top position. He was born in Russia. He had trained as a chemist in Germany and in Switzerland. He was now employed by the University of Manchester as a chemist. He was an important chemist who did important work. Some of you may want to ask me about that after the talk. Why is it that he emerges as the leading figure among British Zionists? As I say, he was one in a million. He was compelling and charismatic. He was uniquely able to charm the British political elite. He was somehow better than anyone else at teaching them unapologetically the principles of Zionism. He also somehow managed to persuade them that all the Jews who counted were Zionist, which was not true, as I've just been explaining. Above all, Weizmann seems to have been uniquely adept at what you might call political jujitsu. He could turn his opponent's strengths to his own advantage. In this case, that meant turning anti-Semitic prejudice to Zionist advantage. Anti-Semites might say that the Jews represent a vast subterranean world influence over socialism in Russia, over finance in the United States. Weizmann said, yes, we do. We do. And you need us more now than ever. And so, at his prompting, British leaders drew what they thought to be the logical deduction. To win the war, they needed Jewish support. To gain Jewish support, they must win over the Zionists. To win over the Zionists, they must promise them Palestine. That's what the Balfour Declaration is all about. It was Weizmann's extraordinary achievement, based on monumental bluff and subterfuge. Because, of course, I don't think I have to say this in here, but I will. The Jews did not have, in 1914, a vast, powerful subterranean influence, and certainly not all Jews were Zionists. So let me sum up to this point. Through the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, the British had won Arab support. They had allowed the Arab rebels to think quite mistakenly that Britain would support establishment of an independent Arab kingdom. Historians and partisans argue whether the Arabs believed from the outset that Palestine would be part of that independent kingdom, but it is absolutely indisputable that McMahon was intentionally vague about that and about much else. That's on the one hand. Simultaneously, the British had won Zionist support by promising to support the establishment of a home for Jews in Palestine, and this they did unambiguously, in writing, in the famous Balfour Declaration. So the Jews thought they'd get Palestine. They had it in writing. The Arabs thought Palestine would probably form a part of this prospective kingdom. They thought they had it in writing, which is to say McMahon's intentionally vague letters. The British here are sowing dragon's teeth. They are creating future problems for the Middle East and for themselves. But there's an entirely separate, not separate, but there's another dimension to this tale, and a dimension that actually constitutes my original contribution to the literature, and a tale that further complicates this already difficult picture. From the moment that the Ottoman Empire entered the war, there were important British people who wanted to arrange a separate peace with Turkey. Please understand at the very beginning The Zionists wanted total victory over Turkey because they believed that Turkish control of Palestine was the greatest obstacle toward Jewish immigration into Palestine. So Zionists, most of them, were unalterably opposed to a separate peace with Turkey. Of course, so were the Arabs. They were rebelling against Turkey, and they didn't want Britain all of a sudden to change sides in their war of independence. Who was it in Britain who favored a separate peace? First of all, there were British Muslims, a small community in Britain in 1914, and they lacked political influence. Such people simply believed that it was a tragedy that the British Empire, which governed 100 million Muslims, should be at war with the Ottoman Empire, which governed even more than 100 million Muslims. But as I say, British Muslims had minimal influence. More significant were British Turkophiles. These were people who believed that Great Britain should return to Britain's traditional 19th century policy, which was to maintain the Ottoman Empire as a bulwark against Russian expansion, especially into the Mediterranean Sea. And then there were also British Turkophiles who said, hold on, we should not be allied in this war with Russia, which is the most tyrannical, backward regime among the great powers, but with the more progressive, more liberal Ottoman Committee of Union and Progress. So these two groups within the Turkophile community did have some influence. They organized the Anglo-Ottoman Association, which was a political pressure group. They recruited important members of parliament from all parties, from both houses of parliament to join it, also men of letters and businessmen and so on. So those are the British Turkophiles. Finally, third, there were the so-called Easterners within the government. These were men who believed that the war with Germany could not be won on the Western Front. The Western Front was simply a meat grinder of men, and therefore a back door to Germany and Austria must be found, and that door could only be in Turkey. Either you could kick open the door, or possibly the Turks would open it for you through some kind of arrangement. Now, Winston Churchill, who was in the government in World War I, was an Easterner who persuaded the cabinet to back the ill-fated attempt to kick open the door into the Ottoman Empire by attacking Gallipoli, right, coming up through the Straits of the Dardanelles. Well, this failed. And then Easterners began thinking more seriously about a secret arrangement with Turkey to get her out of the war by negotiation, to open up that back door. Ooh. Now, my book traces the coming together of these British Muslims, British Turkophiles, and Easterners, and their various attempts to persuade the British government to open a backdoor channel to the Ottomans. Marmaduke Pickthall made the first such effort. He was the son of an Anglican vicar, but he converted to Islam. He wrote the first translation of the Quran into English. He was the author of many novels about life in the Ottoman Empire. Now, his effort to go to Switzerland and to meet with Turks who might be interested in a separate peace arrangement with Great Britain were stymied by none other than Mark Sykes, whom he considered to be a friend. And so he never got a passport that would allow him to travel to Switzerland. And really, he's unimportant in the great scheme of things, and I mention him to you because I love his name. Second, J.R. Pilling was a British Turkophile businessman. He had important financial interests in the Ottoman Empire. Now, he actually had an entree to the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, with whom he met. He got a passport. He was permitted, with Foreign Office support, to travel to Switzerland, where he did, in fact, talk with some Turks. And at first, the Easterners had great hopes for J.R. Pilling. But Pilling, as soon became clear, was a self-interested rogue. He was completely unreliable, and eventually the British government washed its hands of him. They disowned him, and I could never even find a photograph of this man. Oh, wait, sorry. Third, Henry Morgenthau. Much more important in this story. Now, he was an American. He was the former U.S. ambassador to Turkey. Morgenthau had made a fortune as a real estate man, a developer in New York. And he had given a lot of money to the Democratic Party, and he had gotten to know Woodrow Wilson. And he was given a kind of a reward, which was the ambassadorship to Turkey. Now, the United States and Turkey never went to war during World War I. And therefore, it would be possible for Morgenthau to travel and meet with Turks. And he was convinced that he could persuade them to get out of this war. And he persuaded Wilson to endorse this program. Wilson sent him not to Turkey, but to Palestine, ostensibly to check on the condition of Jews in Palestine, but really to talk with Turks in Palestine. However, Chaim Weizmann learned of this expedition, and he was appalled. And he stormed into the Foreign Office, which, by the way, is an index of how quickly he climbed, that he could simply enter the Foreign Office and demand an audience with important people there to protest something that was going on. Now, the Foreign Office calmed him down, and that's because the British government had come to oppose the Morgenthau mission too. Why? Because it was not secret enough. Even Chaim Weizmann knew about it. And if Weizmann did, and if word got out that the British were willing to maybe talk with the Turks about a separate peace, people would begin to think that they weren't confident they could beat them, that they could win the war. It would be bad for the self-confidence of the British people. And so the Foreign Office calmed down Chaim Weizmann. They said, you go and talk to Morgenthau and head him off. And Morgenthau was breaking his journey at Gibraltar, and Weizmann traveled quickly to Gibraltar and met with Morgenthau, and now turned on not the charm, but the iron fist beneath the velvet glove, and completely dominated poor Henry Morgenthau and humiliated him. And Morgenthau turned tail and went back home. Never went to Palestine to talk with Turks about a separate peace. Weizmann went to report to Lloyd George and Balfour, the foreign secretary, who were in Paris for a meeting with other important Allied leaders. And they congratulated Weizmann on having terminated this plan to meet and talk with Turks about a separate peace. Simultaneously, the Foreign Office was arranging for this man, Aubrey Herbert, to go talk to Turks about a separate peace. Literally simultaneously. Weizmann never knew about this. And by the way, no other historian spotted this one either. Now, Aubrey Herbert is one of my favorite historical figures. He was the second son of the Earl of Carnarvon, which made him the half-brother of the discoverer of the tomb of Tutankhamun. He was also, for those of you who have read any of the wonderful thrillers by John Buchan, Aubrey Herbert was the model for Sandy Arbuthnot, the hero of the thriller Green Mantle. He had a lot of experience with the Ottoman Empire. He had traveled all over it. His favorite country was Albania. And somehow he made the acquaintance of Albanian bandits and went galloping through the Albanian countryside with these figures. But at the same time, he knew the cream of Albanian society. And he was twice offered the Albanian throne, which he wanted to accept. But the British Foreign Office would never let him become King of Albania. So he now went to Switzerland, ostensibly to recover from war wounds. He was the first member of parliament to be wounded in the war. He was wounded in the defense of Mons, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, during the retreat that as the Germans advanced at the very beginning of the war. Anyway, traveled to Switzerland, where he did, in fact, meet with Turks. He met them in safe houses. He picked up secret messages on railway platforms. He puts this all in his diary, which I have read. It is as good as a John Buchan thriller. And he returned with proposals, not from the leaders of Turkey, but from dissident Turks who would overthrow the Committee of Union and Progress and arrange a separate peace with Great Britain. And Lloyd George and Balfour received Aubrey Herbert in the same hotel suite that they had received Chaim Weizmann 2 days later. And they congratulated him on starting these separate peace talks with dissident Turks. Well, the Prime Minister of Britain was this man, Lloyd George, one of the greatest figures of 20th century British politics, a confirmed Easterner. And he could not get the idea of a separate peace out of his head. He never knew about Marmaduke Pickthall. He learned to distrust J.R. Pilling. He opposed the Morgenthau mission for the reasons that I've explained. And as for Aubrey Herbert, he feared, and quite correctly, of course, that he was speaking only with so-called second-raters. That was the term he used. That is to say, not with the triumvirate who led Turkey. And so he chose another man to represent his interests in other talks with the Turks, Basil Zaharoff. Now, I don't know if anybody here remembers that name. He is the stock villain in the Tintin comics. If some of you remember a British television series called Riley, Ace of Spies, he appears in that. He was, of course, one of the original merchants of death. That is to say, he was an arms dealer, and he had made a fortune. He had begun as a boy in Constantinople, first as a tout for a brothel, then working for the Constantinople Fire Department, setting fires in order afterwards to share in the spoils. But now he was one of the wealthiest men in Europe. Now, he had been contacted early in the war by a man called Abdul Karim, who had been the former Turkish minister to Greece and Austria. And Zaharoff remembered him fondly because he had bribed him many times in pre-war days. To cut short a long, complicated, absolutely fascinating story, for full details of which please do read the book, Abdul Karim got in touch with Basil Zaharoff and told him that he represented one of the three leaders of the CUP, Enver Pasha, and that Enver was willing to make a deal with the British for a separate peace. Zaharoff got this message to Lloyd George, and Lloyd George, of course, knew right away that Enver Pasha was no second-rater. And so he empowered Zaharoff to meet Abdul Karim in Switzerland to find out what would be Turkey's terms for a separate peace. Now, notice, the Foreign Office, the War Office, they knew about J.R. Pilling's attempt to talk to Turks. The Foreign Office and the Cabinet knew of Aubrey Herbert's contacts with the Turks. Only Lloyd George, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Conservative leader Bonar Law, and possibly one or two others knew about Zaharoff's gambit. And you might ask, why did Bonar Law know? And the answer is that because, as the Chancellor, he would be the man responsible for arranging the multi-million-dollar bribe that would be involved in getting the Turks out of the war. Part of the plan was to pay off first Abdul Karim and then others who would be necessary for the plot, which would be for the Turks basically to open up the Straits of the Dardanelles and let the British through. But then the men who had arranged the plot would have to skedaddle, and they were all going to move to New York. And the bribe was for $12 million, which was a ton of money in 1917. But here's the main point here. Balfour, Lloyd George's foreign secretary, head of the Foreign Office, did not know about this plot. So let me just kind of unfold the layers of intrigue. Number one, think what the Zionists would have said about these various missions to find some kind of separate peace with the Ottoman Empire. That would have allowed Turkey to maintain control of Palestine. Now, they knew that they'd defeated Morgenthau. They knew nothing about Aubrey Herbert. The Arabs would likewise have been absolutely enraged to learn that the British were talking about stabbing them in the back and coming to a separate peace with the regime against which they had rebelled. It's also a fair point that Aubrey Herbert would have been astonished to learn that Zaharoff was the real spokesman for Lloyd George and not himself. And then, as I say, Lloyd George never told Balfour about the Zaharoff mission either. And here is the crucial point, this just as Balfour was about to put his name to the famous declaration, right, promising British support of a home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Prime Minister Lloyd George was prepared to double-cross the Zionists, the Arabs, his own foreign secretary, in order to get a separate peace with Turkey. Just as I'm not a French historian, I'm not a Turkish historian, and I've never been in the Turkish archives, but from British archives, it is clear that an even darker picture of deceit and betrayal takes place on that side of the line. Aside from Enver, the great Turkish leader really was this man called Talat Pasha. Now, Talat Pasha was not involved, as far as Zaharoff knew, in the scheme that Enver was being approached about. And at one point, he asked Abdul Karim, what about Talat? What does Enver have in mind for Talat? And Abdul Karim said to Basil Zaharoff that Talat was maybe being a little difficult at this point, but if he didn't come round, quote, I myself will give him his coffee. In other words, that he would poison him. what Abdul Karim didn't know, and what Enver didn't know, but what I subsequently found out, was that Talat was behind the missions exploring a separate peace with Aubrey Herbert and J.R. Pilling. Now, Zaharoff met Abdul Karim several times in Switzerland during the summer and fall of 1917, but the climax came on January 27, 1918, 3 months nearly after the Balfour Declaration had been made public. Enver snuck into Switzerland, and Zaharoff did too. And Abdul Karim shuttled between the two men. Zaharoff describes him in a letter to Lloyd George as a sort of, quote, human telephone. Lloyd George had provided Zaharoff with the British desiderata. And the crux of it, for our purposes, the negotiating position included the following inducement, and I'm quoting from the instructions given to Zaharoff, quote, Palestine will not be annexed or incorporated in the British Empire. 3 months after the publication of the Balfour Declaration. Had Enver accepted this offer, we wouldn't be here tonight. Nobody would be thinking very much about the Balfour Declaration. It would have been sidelined by history. It would be merely another of the many beautiful promises made during the war by politicians of every party and every country to persuade their soldiers to go on fighting and dying. Promises like no annexations and no indemnities. Some of you will know these phrases, or open covenants openly arrived at, or of course, most sorrowful of all, war to end all wars. But Enver did not accept. Why not? And of course it has to do with the date. January 1918, Turkey and Germany thought they could still win the war. This was the time of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, when the Russians were basically surrendering, getting out of the war. It's before American troops have begun to arrive in Europe in anything like sufficient numbers to make a difference. The main reason why Britain and Turkey never concluded a separate peace is that whenever one party was really interested in one, the other was not, because it thought it was going to win. They were interested when they were not positive they would win. They were disinterested when they were confident. Whenever Britain was willing to zig, Turkey was about to zag. And so it continued from 1914 to 1918. And now I can conclude. Too often, historians have deemed the declaration which bears the name of this man to have been the inevitable product of Chaim Weizmann's brilliant campaign to educate and win over the British governing elite to the Zionist program. In fact, the Balfour Declaration was the highly contingent result of a tortuous process that might have turned out very differently. That process was characterized as much by deceit and betrayal as by adherence to principle and liberal values. And today, or tonight, I've really only touched the tip of the iceberg so far as deceit and betrayal go. You may know about the Greek myth. Cadmus slew the dragon, and by the advice of Athena sowed its teeth. When they were sown, there rose from the ground armed men. Well, during World War I, Britain sowed dragons' teeth in the Middle East. And their fruit was suspicion, resentment, recrimination, hatred. Soldiers rose up from the ground, and as we all know, they are rising still. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions from the audience. Please bear with me. I'm going to pass the mic to people so that other people in the audience can hear your questions.
I thank you. I was in the impression that Weizmann invented nylon.
No.
Or what?
I'm not an expert, but he developed another way to derive acetone, which was essential for British explosives. It had previously been derived mainly, I think, from wood, and he figures out how to derive it from grain. Something like that. It's a very important contribution to the British war effort.
Therefore, they owed him.
No, that's the popular story. There's this Lloyd George, I think, wrote somewhere in his memoirs something like, he said to Weizmann, "What can I do for you? Because you've done so much for us." And Weizmann said, "I want nothing for myself, but I want Palestine for my people." There is absolutely no evidence that this is true. Yeah. What Weizmann really wanted was a British title. That's what
I have
really
two
wanted.
questions. First is, did Ataturk have anything to do with this at all? Or did he come after World War II?
World War One.
One.
He comes after.
After. And he was not involved in any of
I never
this.
find him in the research.
Second question is, the declaration, the paragraph you read, had a proviso in it.
Yes.
Which said, provided they don't take rights from
Yes.
non-Jews living in
Yes.
Palestine.
Yes. I did say that, actually.
Yeah, was that violated before Israel became a state? And it was violated after they became a state. What happened with that in both cases?
Right. Well, so I'm going to run away from your question. I'm an expert on what happened up to November 2, 1917. I know a bit about what happened after, but I just don't want to get involved in those discussions. So, with respect, I respectfully decline.
Yeah, when the Zionists started arriving in the late 1800s, did they need at that time permission from the Ottoman authorities to settle in Palestine?
Yes, they did. And I can say a bit more. The Ottomans were not opposed to Jews immigrating into the Ottoman Empire. They welcomed them by and large as useful, productive citizens. What they didn't want was a critical mass of them in Palestine, because that would upset the people who lived in Palestine already, and they just didn't want the trouble.
Professor Schneer, thank you very much for personalizing all of this. I love to watch spy dramas, and currently am watching Madam Secretary. But this, if you put that in the TV shows, they'd say it's, too far-fetched. And we've only scratched the surface. I'm going to read your book. My question is, with all of the fuss that led up to the Balfour Declaration, how important actually was the Declaration in finally leading to, quotes, this Jewish homeland?
Yeah. I think it was very, very important. Without reference to the motives of the British in making it, and here's why I think that. The Zionists wanted, above all, British support. They didn't want French support very much, because they were afraid that if the French established a protectorate in Palestine, the French would insist on their becoming more French than they were Jewish. And they believed that the British would allow them to maintain their Jewish identity. They would have, I think, perhaps welcomed an American protectorate, but that was not practical politics. Nobody was interested in that. They abhorred the idea of international control. And what they wanted above all was the British to establish a protectorate and then to allow Jews to come in. And although the British disappointed them, I'm slightly getting to the question you were asking, over the next 20 years, by not allowing unrestricted immigration, nevertheless, they allowed quite a few got in there in the 20s and 30s. And therefore, I guess what I was also going to say is that therefore it's a precondition to the state of Israel, right? If not for the Balfour Declaration, I think everything would be different. I don't know how it would be different.
You've given a terrific talk, despite the fact that hundreds of Jewish Sunday school teachers in their graves are turning rapidly. The whole point, from obviously your point of view and mine, is the contingencies that Britain faced in the November of 1917. And there are three elements in there that I'd like to hear you comment on. Number one, the expression of quote unquote world Jewry, which Japan, if I'm correct, sent a letter endorsing Balfour, because that way the Allies will have the support of world Jewry. And the other, which is absolutely amazing to me, is that Arnold Toynbee in the Foreign Office endorsed, quote unquote, the Zionist card.
Yeah.
Do you mind just repeating the comments? I don't know if everyone heard.
You want me to somehow comment on the phrase world Jewry?
Yes. Because I think it played a part in the Allied.
Yes. Okay, maybe I didn't say this clearly enough. The anti-Semitic notion that Jews somehow have great influence over world socialism, world finance, banking, and so on. That was I have the evidence for it that British leaders believed that stuff. So I believe, and I think it's typical of the times. Okay, so I don't know if the Japanese really believed that or if they just said it. I have no idea because I don't. But the French, also issued their own sort of Balfour Declaration, and so did the Italians. But it was the British one that counted. And you're absolutely right that part of the reason for it was this belief that the Jews were an important force that would be better on their side than on the other side. And I can say one final thing about this, which is that there were a few Germans who were saying the same thing to the equivalent of the German Foreign Office. And one of the impetuses for pushing the Balfour Declaration on November 2, 1917, and not later, was that there were people in the government and the Foreign Office who were afraid that if the British didn't do it, the Germans would, and would get this important world factor on their side, and which raises the most extraordinary hypothetical. Suppose Chaim Weizmann had stayed in Berlin, where he had gotten his PhD in chemistry and had been the leader of German Zionism. Talk about contingency, right? So.
Thank you for being here, Professor. We've really enjoyed your eloquent remarks. Can you comment briefly on the state of the Ottoman Empire and leadership just prior to this time?
Well, I'm not a Turkish historian. All right. That said, I can give you a little bit. The Ottoman Empire had once been one of the greatest empires in the world, and in 1674 it had expanded across northern Africa and up into Spain and through southern Europe, the Balkans, and had gone north and even besieged the gates of Vienna, 1674. And from then on it began to contract. By the time you get to the 19th century, people are calling it the sick man of Europe. And little by little, the different I don't know what to call them. The components were either demanding and receiving more and more autonomy, or were actually breaking out. The Committee of Union and Progress came in, overthrew the corrupt regime, but I'm blocking the dates. I think it could be the 1870s. That can't be right. It would be a little bit later. And they begin trying to modernize the empire. So by 1914, this has proceeded to some degree, but they made the absolutely wrong decision and backed the Germans rather than the Allies in the war. If they'd been on the winning side, it would have been completely different. And half the cabinet wanted to support the Allies, half the cabinet wanted to support the Germans, and it was Enver who engineered a kind of actually what he did was, if I remember this correctly, he had German soldiers dressed as Russians. Let me get this right. Yes, in battleships in the Black Sea, bombard Turkish ports, and then got Turkey to declare war on the Russians, and thus on the British and the French. Right. Well, it was a terrible decision. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for a wonderful talk. I was wondering, could you give us an indication as far as how this Balfour Declaration affected the Jews? What were the number of Jews who were living in Palestine prior to that, and how many of them immigrated in the next 10, 20 years, especially in the 20s, which I presume would have been the time where the Declaration would have had the most importance?
There were in Palestine in 1914, I think, 700,000 people, and Jews represented less than 10%. I cannot tell you the figures for immigration during the 1920s. I'll bet there is someone in this room who knows them, but it's beyond my November 2, 1917 cutoff date. Tens of thousands, but still by 1939, the Arabs outnumber the Jews, I think, still 2 to 1, or close to that, in 1939. It's World War II, of course, that, right.
After the war, they assembled the League of Nations, and they created the Palestine Mandate of Britain. Right. And if you read that document, so much of it, surprisingly much, is talks about how we're establishing this mandate as a homeland for the Jews. How did that happen? That became the major reason why Britain gets to create a mandate with the purpose of creating a homeland for the Jews in the League of Nations and in the British Mandate, Palestine.
All right. Well, so first of all, you're also asking me about post-1917, which so I can't tell you precisely when, but the French and the British come to an agreement, basically, about the Middle East. And the agreement is that the French are going to have Syria, and the British are going to have Palestine and Mesopotamia. And so all the stuff, there is bargaining, I'm sure, behind closed doors at Versailles during the deliberations for the treaty. But that's the answer, I think, to your question. They've divided it up, and the other thing, of course, is they divided it up quite selfishly, right? And again, don't think that it was because the British had, in 1920 or 1919, had some soft spot for Jews and wanted them in Palestine. It was, if they wanted them there, it was at least in part because Palestine overlooks Egypt. Egypt has the Suez Canal. So Palestine is very important strategically. Better to have in Palestine a white, grateful population, stable, industrious, than those shiftless Arabs, something like that. That was part of their thinking, for sure.
One more question?
Just one thing. The Balfour Declaration does not declare a homeland.
No, a home.
It declares a national home.
Yes.
For which nobody knew what that meant.
That's right. That's right. But I think that they start talking about a homeland at Versailles, actually.
But in the terms of the Declaration,
Yeah, it's a,
doesn't say it.
no, it does not. Thank
Professor
you.
Schneer, thank you. Thank all of you very much. Remember, books are on sale in the back. And for those who purchase, you can get a signature. Yes.